It seems like every time I go to write a script about anything that's not a mech, a gun, or a gun on a mech, it metamorphizes into something completely untethered from my original premise and forces me to retool my entire thought process to compensate. Anyway, that's all just a long-winded way to say that I've tried to cast this damn ship off at least 8 times now, and lacking a way to lead you into its premise that's not pregnant with a world tree, or doesn't have a secret hyperdimensional warp gate installed in it. I'm just going to cut right to the chase. This whole mess started off as me talking about how strange it was that the rogue mages who supposedly engineered the Witchers could master the genetic sciences before discovering that a jar full of sulfur saltpeter and charcoal goes kaboom if you set fire to it. This then spiraled off into about 5 pages of me talking about magic guns, or rather the lack thereof in popular fiction, which then became me referencing Shadiversity and how he's talked about fantasy adventuring guilds and what they might actually be like, what would be their purpose, how they would actually function in quasi-medieval Europe, etc., etc., and then this brought me back to thinking about the Witcher world, which in turn led me to draft a full 16-section articles and contract for a fictitious adventurers guild, filled with enough bylines and clauses to turn on Disney's lawyers via quantum entanglement, a PDF of which you can find over on X links in the description. So now, with all of that mess out on the table, let me see if I can untangle it in fewer words than a Greco-Roman epic. All right. Here goes. So, about a month ago, I stumbled upon a video wondering about why fantasy seems to be allergic to guns. Even America, a country famously built by the gun, seemingly has no higher value for the things outside of their being a patriotic symbol, which, to put it in fantasy terms, is about on par with how a medieval peasant would have regarded music or alcohol, more a symbol of irreverent, carnal indulgence bounding on sinful chaos than of noble strength and courage. Granted, this can mostly be chalked up to a difference in cultures and time periods. After all, most medieval fantasy is a mock-up of medieval England, which is a precursor to Napoleonic Britain, which the Americans famously did not vibe with. However, I think the simpler, and by far most promising explanation is that the American West never had a romantic, in the Platonic sense, epic ballad or story surrounding the noble exploits of a stately king and his mighty weapon, tonitruum, which means thunder in Latin. I'll have you notice my choice of words there. Now ask yourself, why are swords considered a hero's weapon while bows and spears aren't? Apart from the latter being a commoner's weapon, and nobody wants to imagine themselves as a common foot soldier, the sword is the weapon of kings, most famously King Arthur, just as the pistol is the weapon of military officers and lawmen, i.e. the types of people who don't expect to need weapons, but who are perfectly capable of joining in a fight if one comes looking for them. If you can't already see where I'm going with this from orbit, consider why it is that, even when they do use a gun, a protagonist almost always carries a pistol while the enemies have rifles, grenades, shotguns, and such. Why would that be? Well, I believe that the pistol has several crucial things in common with a sword that make it feel proper in the hands of someone a modern Western audience would root for, even when they know exactly nothing about weapons or fighting. For one, it's a sidearm, not a main battlefield weapon. Much like the spear, halberd, or bow of antiquity, most people don't go about their usual daily business with an assault rifle or claymore slung across their back. And if they do, they're very likely not going to expect to receive, or to be very forthcoming with social niceties, and so would almost certainly be made a person of great interest, if not a pariah, to most everyone with a vested interest in making it home that night. All of which is to say that the sword, in its real battlefield or civilian role as a secondary oh-shit defensive weapon that only gets drawn under desperate circumstances, aligns with modern Western, Christian, values much more than the old Western Gunsmoke-style desperado whose conscience was as clear as the desert sky, but whose rap sheet could wrap around the solar system. And seeing as how the grandfather of modern fantasy, Tolkien's Middle-earth, was woven out of a sophisticated blend of Norse pagan and Catholic Christian themes and ideas, to me, it seems fairly elementary to draw a line connecting one to the other. You'll notice I specifically mentioned Christian moral values there. Why is that? Well, here's where I'm going to add 2 new pieces to this schizophrenic puzzle. Those of you who saw my video about why Luke Skywalker is the Jedi chosen one, not Anakin, will recall how I described the Jedi and Sith philosophies as being, in not so few words, 90% idealist / 10% realist, and 90% cynical / 10% real, respectively. Thinking about it some more, and keeping in mind the times in which the majority of Star Wars lore was written, I've come to the conclusion that this is the same source of division among our real-world factions. What does any of this have to do with our fantasy being allergic to guns? Just trust me, we'll get there, I promise. I just need to set up one other thing first. Anyone who's played the Witcher games will be familiar with the philosophy of said verse. In essence, it is to shine a light upon the paradox of humans creating an alien race of monster hunters to protect them from alien races of monsters, only to then go and vilify said same race themselves as monsters, while at the same time being every bit as monstrous as the creatures they created the hunters to hunt. Confused yet? Don't worry, all you need to understand is that the Witchers, as a concept, exist solely to make a moral point. And that's the issue I personally take with the setting, because otherwise, on a purely nerdy level, I love how the Witcher universe handles the quote-unquote realistic integration of supernatural creatures, griffins, dragons, vampires, etc., into a fantasy medieval setting. The only problem is that I'm expected to believe that mages in this world were able to not only crack the genetic code, but also master the arcane arts of teleportation, transfiguration, transmutation, necromancy, long-distance communication, and even artificial life extension. But the idea of making an explosion in a tube to throw a metal projectile was completely beyond their ken. Now, recall what I said about the Jedi and the Sith and Christianity a moment ago. Now consider that fantasy, as a genre, exists to essentially fill a hole in society left by religion when it got supplanted as the one truth in the mainstream zeitgeist by the material sciences, all of which I've made other videos expounding on. And from there we can reason that, much like the Jedi Code, Christianity, with its guiding ethos of equality under God and concept of original sin, makes it a functionally impossible doctrine to execute or even act intelligently on if taken literally, since it is logically incompatible with practical reality. And much like the Sith, postmodernism pretends to be liberal, that is freeing us of all arbitrary rules and restrictions, claiming to embrace pride and to not cower behind lofty excuses to not act, all of which, to some greater or lesser extent, is true. But it's as true as that they actually do nothing but destroy, corrode, rot, and terminally infest everything they or their carnal ideology come into contact with both sides ultimately defining themselves as the opposite of each other by upholding as virtuous that which the other finds sinful. This is why they both had to be destroyed on the conceptual level in order for true cosmic balance to be achieved. As you can hopefully at least start to see by this point, our modern fantasy is a reflection of this insistent bifurcation of lofty idealism and visceral realism. The one side upholding its heady ideals as empirical fact, while only superficially conceding the ultimate supremacy of natural laws over moral codes. The other excusing their reckless indulgences by appealing to the chaotic mire of the natural order. And as a consequence, we see unabashedly high-minded fairy stories like Lord of the Rings and Narnia pitted against the unhallowed grim darkness of settings like Warhammer and Game of Thrones, with more gray matter like The Witcher, Lovecraft, and Conan trapped in ideological limbo between. Now, obviously, this is an overly simplistic diagram, and I'll readily concede that Tolkien's lore and world as conceived in the books is far more nuanced and sophisticated than the good versus evil slugfest Peter Jackson, for all his amply due credit, made it out to be. However, believe it or not, I am here to make a point. And that point is that, the arbitrary brain farts of pearl-clutching busybodies and authoritarian bureaucrats notwithstanding, our fantasy is a product of our times. And in our time, it is neither fashionable nor honorable for a quote-unquote hero to fight from a distance a target whose inability to defend themselves and or their rank within the ruling social order makes them a helpless victim rather than an opponent, regardless of their other powers or the severity of their crimes. Take, for example, John Wick. He's an anti-hero, even though everyone unanimously agrees that his reason for getting back in the business was 100% justified. Anyway, I think that might be the most unhinged rant of a video I've ever made. Fortunately, I don't claim to be an enlightened sage. I'm just a guy with some thoughts that occasionally sound coherent enough to pass for words of sound, worldly wisdom. And other times my brain just shoots strange lightning jitters into the earth that sort of look like constellations, which I then spend 3 days meticulously analyzing like a cottage-mad hermit who thinks the pattern of falling leaves are a sign from the gods. Okay, I'm gonna call it quits for the day. If you made it to the end, I don't know what to say other than you may want to get that dark spot on your brain scan looked at. It might be malignant. In any case, let me know your thoughts in the usual place. Check out my books if, for some reason, you want more of this sort of non-compos mentis gobbledygook. And until next time, stay safe, stay sane, and don't forget to take your meds. Peace.